Right, this time I thought I'd do something different. I thought I'd do a ranking video on the British and English monarchs. It's just for a bit of fun. I just want to say as well, I by no means see myself as like some sort of historian. This is just purely out of interest, and I've always been like interested in history and the history of our English monarchs and that. Before the internet and everything, got a couple of books here that I used to enjoy. Kings and Queens of England. It's a decent book. Used to read this a lot. And history of Britain as well. I've had these books for a long time. This was before like the internet and what have you. So there's a nice picture in here as well. Where is it? I'll just show you. I think wrong book. This is a Kings and Queens of England. Yeah, it starts off with Alfred the Great and works all the way to obviously Elizabeth II. It's this one I wanted to show you. Yeah, right at the front, nice picture of Bamburgh Castle. I've actually been to Bamburgh Castle, it's really nice. If you ever get the chance to go to like Northumberland area of England, it's worth checking out. So yeah, I think I've got all the kings and queens in order here. They're all like mixed up. Sorry about all the advertisements as well, like you can see. Apparently on this website, tiermaker.com, to use it properly and to do whatever you want with it, you've got to create a Twitter account. And there's no way I'm creating a Twitter account because Twitter and TikTok to me are like the trash heap of the internet. And so let's get started. There's also the Saxon kings here that you can see at the bottom. I'm not going to include them. I'm going to start with William the Conqueror, 1066, just because a lot of the times in English history we usually start from 1066 and work our way up. I might do a separate video on the Anglo-Saxon kings and the Viking kings as well. I don't think there's as much known about them as they are from, say, the Normans onwards. I mean, Alfred the Great is usually considered one of the best, if not the greatest, English kings, although he wasn't king of the whole of England. But yeah, we're going to leave the Saxon kings out and start with 1066. Again, I might get a few things wrong here, I might get a few things mixed up, but it's just for a bit of fun. Right. Trouble is with William the Conqueror, I'll just finish my mint tea. Yeah, nice mint tea. Yeah, William the Conk. Where'd you put him? Because, oh yeah, I've done my own Northern English expressions. I've got champion, sound, alright, meh, bad, bell end, and inconclusive. I thought that was fair enough. So William the Conk, you could put him anywhere really, William the Conqueror, because he's like, obviously he's known as this great king, you know, he defeated Harold, Battle of Hastings, but he also, a lot of historians say he committed genocide. He killed a lot of English people, had them starved to death, especially in the north of England. He was extremely brutal. He was French or Norman. So a lot of English people were just used to the Saxon way of life. So obviously having this like French/Norman invader. I don't know, where'd you put William the Conk? I think we're going to put him in the middle, because you could put him here, you could put him there. So for argument's sake, we'll just stick him right in the middle. William the Bastard, he was also known as in his time, because I think he grew up without a father and his mum wasn't married. Built a lot of castles, some to which stand to this day. I think he was a great soldier. He was lucky to win the Battle of Hastings as well, because Harold had just fought off the last Viking invasion and had a great victory there. So I think a lot of his men either was wounded, killed, or died of disease on the way down to the south of England to fight against William. So he was kind of lucky that he actually won that battle. But in terms of his reign and as King of England, yeah, we're going to stick him in the middle. Like I said, I could stick him anywhere, but because of his brutality, he's known for the Doomsday Book as well, which was like a written accounts of the working class of England. So we get a lot of history from that in terms of what it was like. I think that was like during the latter part of his reign. We'll just stick him in the middle. So anyway, then it goes on to William II, Rufus, this guy here. I think he was nicknamed Rufus because of his red hair. The Normans were like descendants from the Vikings, so they had a lot of like Danish blood in them. So I think a lot of them had like red hair and blonde hair. They were actually more Viking than they were French. William Rufus, William II. I think he's best known for being the king who got killed in a hunting accident. The fact that the only other two people that were with him were his younger brother who became Henry I and I think Henry I's friend. Yeah, there's a lot of conspiracies over that. I mean, apparently to this day it's considered an accident. Many don't believe it was an accident and it was deliberate, but yeah, he was unfortunately killed in a hunting accident. I think he carried on doing a lot of stuff that his father did. I mean, carried on building castles, wanted to protect England from any invaders. Not necessarily a bad king as such. He wasn't king for very long. Yeah, we'll put William Rufus. I think we'll put him meh against his father again. So not a lot to say about him really. Nothing bad, nothing great. Got killed in a hunting accident while his brother Henry I was there. Henry I, I think a lot of the peasants regarded him as firm but fair in his reign. So quite a decent king. I think he was well respected. Again, a lot of castles were being built again to protect whatever land he had. He was known as creating checks. So yeah, Henry I, we'll put him in alright. I think he was considered a fairly decent king. Nothing really too bad to say about him. I think he was known for his son and the heir to the throne, William, for being killed in that drunken shipwreck incident. I think here in the middle of the Saxon kings for some reason is Matilda, and I want to include Matilda, but we're going to put her in inconclusive. Basically, Matilda was Henry's daughter, but no woman in her own right at the time had ever ruled England. Plus Matilda was extremely unpopular, both with I think like the barons and the public. And what really happened was Stephen here, who was Henry's nephew and William's cousin, who was Prince William, the heir to the throne, I think he was invited to become king, and his brother was the archbishop, so obviously, you know, he had it made, didn't he? So he came to England, possibly with an army, and took the throne of England, and obviously this led to civil war between Matilda and Stephen. I think Stephen had a larger army, and obviously he was more popular, had a lot more backing, had a lot of people wanted him to become king, and nobody wanted Matilda to become queen pretty much. But this led to a lot of wars. I think he ended up getting imprisoned as well, but then he was released. And yeah, his reign was just dogged by war really. I don't think he was a bell end or bad. A lot of people would probably consider him a bad king, but It's just the consequences of what happened during his reign. Why is he cockeyed as well? If you've noticed, this portrait of him, he's like cockeyed. I don't think he'd be very impressed with that. But yeah, Stephen. Where do we put Stephen? Hey, it's a tough one. These Norman kings are a tough one. Again, I'll put him at meh, because I think at the beginning of his reign he was actually quite popular and well liked, but because most of his reign was dogged by war, yeah, we'll put him in the middle. It'd be unfair to him to put him like extremely bad, because there's a lot of like propaganda and things throughout history which deem some of these kings as bad or evil or whatever, and I think it'd be unfair to put him as a really bad king of all the things that he had to go through as king. But he certainly wasn't a great king, so we'll just stick him in the middle. So at the end of the war, civil war, they come to some sort of agreement that Matilda's son, who became Henry II, becomes king. He was obviously the grandson of Henry I. Losing track here already. So yeah, I think Stephen originally wanted his son to become king, but I think his son died before he did, not long before he died. And he agreed that Henry would become king anyway, and I think even Stephen's son was going to end up going to war with his own father over that, but that never happened, and Matilda's son became king. I think Henry II, we're going to put him in... do we put him in sound? We put him in R8. We'll put Henry II in R8. Henry II was a pretty decent king. He owned a lot of land in France and England. Extremely powerful king. The only trouble with Henry II's reign is it's known by the Thomas Becket affair, where he put his friend Thomas Becket as Archbishop, thinking that he'd have one over him by doing that, but it backfired. And basically the king wasn't above the church, so Thomas Becket could pretty much like tell Henry to piss off if he wanted to, sort of thing. So basically they squabbled, and as everyone knows, I think it's Shakespeare's play, is it, where he goes, "Who will rid me of his troublesome priest?" And Henry II's knights proclaim that to be like, well, let's go and get this priest, and they literally murder him in the cathedral, which even by medieval standards was considered like ridiculous. But to have his sins forgiven, he ended up getting whipped by a load of monks or something. So the public's opinion of him sort of like came back a little bit, because he realised he messed up big time. But on top of that, he gave his sons basically land, and they all squabbled, and Richard even went to war with his own father, and I think he beat his father in a battle. And yeah, there was just a lot of squabbling between his sons and him, because he had vast amounts of land. So I think overall, Henry II is considered a strong, likeable king. He just messed up a couple of times. I think he just died of old age. I can't really remember. I think he was like exhausted because he'd been at war with his sons, especially Richard. And yeah, bit of a strange one how he died, Henry II. Probably just of old age. But anyway, Henry dies. Not a bad king. And then Richard the Lionheart, Richard I. Now the thing is with Richard I, obviously he's one of the better known kings of England. he's seen as this crusader king, a hero, great soldier, but a terrible king in my opinion. I think he was only king for like 10 years, and in those 10 years he was only actually in England for 6 months, and he didn't even want to be in England. He wasn't interested in being king of England, and he was a Frenchman. He wasn't even an Englishman. He spoke French, or a Norman, whatever you want to call him, but he was a Frenchman. And he said he would sell London if he could find a buyer just to pay for his crusades. I actually think because of him, John gets a bad rap, because he sunk the country into debt, and obviously the only way to get out of that is to raise taxes, which started to happen after his reign as well. He ended up getting captured in Austria on the way back from his crusades, and I think he was in prison for quite some time, maybe a year, and they had to raise money to bail him out of prison, which was something ridiculous, like billions in today's money. It pretty much sunk England into bankruptcy, and it was all because of Richard. And yet he's seen as this great king, but I think the best thing to say about Richard, he was a great soldier, terrible king, and he's also known for the 3 lions, the symbol of the 3 lions, which is on the English national football team. And it's sort of like a national symbol of England as well, the 3 lions. So he sort of created that. That was his sort of like standard, I think, when in the Crusades. He was originally, I think he was a Duke of Normandy, but his father Henry II gave him lands in Normandy. And he was actually nicknamed Richard the Lionheart as a prince, I think it were, because of his brutality, because he had a couple of battles and wars in France to protect his land, and he was nicknamed the Lionheart because of that. So I think his nickname came before he even became king. So to be honest, I'm going to put Richard as a king, not as a soldier. As a soldier he's obviously up here, but as a king, bad. He was brutal. He was a Frenchman, and he didn't even conquer Jerusalem as well. I mean, I think he had a lot of respect in the Crusades, and Saladin had a lot of respect for him, but ultimately he didn't take Jerusalem from Saladin. But the history around him is interesting, but he wasn't a great king. And next we're going to King John. Oh, I'd just like to say as well, just before we go on to King John, Richard's death, apparently he was doing an unimportant siege on a castle, which was typical of Richard, and he gets shot, I think somewhere around his shoulder or neck. An arrow goes in, and he dies later of his wounds, and they capture the guy who shot him, and it was some kid, I think he was like a cook or something, shot him with a crossbow arrow, and apparently he forgave him and even gave him some money. But after he died, Richard's bodyguards basically recaptured him and fleed him to death. And if you don't know what fleeing is, I think it's when they skin someone alive, so it was like the worst possible torture or death to give anybody, but obviously it was seen as treason. But yeah, it's just crazy madness. King John, again, another king who suffers from propaganda, because obviously the whole Robin Hood tale, which was done many years after, I think it was like 1600s, was it, Robin Hood? And I'm not saying that King John was a great king by any means, but I think a lot of the things that happened during his reign were unfortunate for him, because there was a lot of stuff building up, and it just so happened it landed during the reign of King John, and he had to like sort it all out the best he could, and he didn't do a very good job of it. Again, the fact that he raised a lot of taxes, I think a lot of this was caused by his older brother as well, Richard. He was also nicknamed John Lackland, but that was when he was a young boy as a prince, because when Henry II was spreading out all of his lands and giving them to all his sons. He was nicknamed Lapland because I think he only got a small piece of land, which is in Ireland. So he was nicknamed Lapland because of that as a boy, not because he lost territories as a king. Yeah, he lost quite a lot of French territories as well, I mean, because unlike his older brother Richard, he wasn't really much of a soldier. However, I just watched a documentary recently on John, and he's not as terrible as I think some people make out. He did do a lot of travelling, and he even kept a diary, and he there's specific notes on every day on things that he did, places he visited. So I think because of what went on with the barons, the taxes, he also had disagreements with the Pope. Then obviously Magna Carta came about, which is obviously what everyone talks about when they think of King John, apart from Robin Hood, which is a lot of bollocks anyway. But the Magna Carta, you've got to understand as well though, even the Pope said anybody practicing Magna Carta in England is basically expelled from the church as well. So like the Magna Carta wasn't just going against King John and the kingship, it was going against the Pope and the church as well, because the Pope was technically King John's boss as well. So King John gets a lot of bad rap, but I'm not saying he was a great king by any means, but some people say he was like the worst king of England. He wasn't. We'll just put him in bad, because I actually think as a king he was better than Richard. At least, you know, he travelled England a lot. I think he did his best. He was just unfortunate. He didn't do himself many favours. But was he a tyrant? I don't think he were. And I think if Richard had been king another 20 years, Magna Carta would have just been written anyway. It was just like it just happened while he was king. So, and he didn't do himself any favours either. But we'll just put him as a bad King John, as he was also nicknamed. But yeah, not the worst English king, I don't think. So anyway, towards the end of his reign anyway, again there's a lot of question marks over his death. I think some say he was poisoned. I think he died of dysentery. Also Henry I, I forgot to say, I think died of food poisoning because he was eating a lot of these exotic fishes and his doctor told him not to. Something like that. But yeah, apparently they say King John was poisoned, I think, but nobody really knows. And that left his son, Henry III, to become king. Now Henry III was a boy, I think, when John died, so his early reign was sort of like he didn't really have much power or say over anything. He had one of the longest reigns of any monarch, but that was because he became king when he was a boy and he lived to like, I don't know, his 50s or something. So he had quite a long reign up until I think George III. He was the longest reigning king, probably the longest reigning monarch as well. And Henry III, again, there was a lot of discontent with the barons. I think Magna Carta was written another 2 times because there was reissues of the Magna Carta, and I think he did to a degree accept it, but then he didn't, just like John, his father, did. And again, his son bailed him out quite a bit because his son was Edward I, and he was considered a great, strong prince. I think he went off to the Crusades as well. We'll get on to him in a sec. And I think Edward, as a young prince, did a lot of dirty work for Henry III, his father. I don't think Henry III was a particularly strong king, but again, he wasn't terrible. It was just more of the same, really. I mean, the barons and the Magna Carta and all that lot. We'll put him... Do we put him Henry III? It's a tough one. We'll put him at meh. I think he did his best. He had a long reign. Nothing terrible about him, so we'll stick him in meh. So the next one, Edward I, Longshanks, Hammer of the Scots. Again, another king that gets a lot of bad propaganda against him. He was regarded as one of the greatest Britons in a vote, I think in the early noughties that they had. I would just like to say as well, we're on to the Plantagenets now. I mean, the Norman kings were pretty much all the way up to Henry II, this chap here. I think Stephen was from a different house, but these, like, we considered the Norman kings all the way up to Henry II, then it's the start of the Plantagenets, which had the longest sort of like dynasty so far. A lot of kings of the Plantagenets era. So anyway, Edward I. Again, most people know this guy from watching the film Braveheart and William Wallace, which is very historically inaccurate, and I think he was a strong king. He brought a lot of stability to England. He obviously invaded Wales. That was his first sort of conquest, and he made his son the Prince of Wales, and to this day that's stood. So like every time the king comes to the throne, his heir to the throne is the Prince of Wales, and that all started with Edward I. He built a lot of castles in Wales. It's one of the reasons why Wales has so many great castles, because of Edward. Just kind of like what William the Conqueror did to England, Edward kind of did the same to Wales. He also conquered about half of Scotland, all the way up to like Edinburgh, around there, and didn't manage to conquer all of Scotland. Obviously there was a lot of rebellion against that, and a lot of battles between England and Scotland. Edward I, I think he's the first king we're going to put as sound. Obviously not very well liked in Scotland because of the history of what happened during his reign, but I think he probably wants to unite Scotland and Wales with England, but I think he appointed a king of Scotland into while he was a king. My mind is a bit hazy with that era, but ultimately the Scots rebelled, and yeah, William Wallace was executed during his reign. I think the film Braveheart shows William Wallace being executed and then Edward dying. I think he reigned for at least another couple of years after that. He was a strong king, strong prince. He brought stability to England. I think he was well respected. Maybe even some of the Scots liked him, I don't really know. Possibly not, but I think he's considered a decent king. And I think he did a lot in France as well, because obviously a lot of territories were lost during John and Henry's reign, but Edward was obviously the king that was going to take back as much territory as he could, and he was a good soldier. I think he was a well-respected king, and this was like the medieval era, so obviously that came with a lot of bloodshed. But you know, I think all in all, Edward I is considered a great king, and possibly not in Scotland, obviously, but there you go. We'll stick him in sound. I wouldn't stick him in champion, just because he didn't really take Wales or Scotland in a civilised manner, but the Romans did the same. The Anglo-Saxons tried it again, so he was basically just doing like what every conqueror or king had tried to do in history anyway. I mean, you can look at it as a good thing or as a bad thing. I think in general, though, historians consider him a decent king, so we'll stick him in sound. And from sound to one of the worst kings England ever had. Nothing like his father, completely useless, lost tons of territory in France. All the territories that his father had, and all the hard work that he'd done in Scotland was lost to this guy here. Terrible, terrible king. Yeah, he was a bit of a bell end, I think. He had certain people executed at the whim. I think there were a lot of questions over his sexuality at the time, which obviously this was the medieval period, so that wasn't looked on great gesture. Yeah, Edward II, not a great king by any means. Apparently, he was so bad, I think his own mother overthrowed him with her partner and imprisoned him. That's how much of a bad king he were. And they say that he got a hot rod poker stuck up his arse and was tortured. But I think he was locked up and starved to death. I don't know, I mean, there's a lot of conspiracies over how he met his end, but not a great king. He was a bit of an arsehole, so we'll stick him in the bell end territory. So, on to Edward III. This guy here, is that Edward III? I've seen quite a few portraits of him, but yeah, it must be Edward III. I think I've got it all in order. Edward III, I think the whole medieval period of England, the way people think of chivalry and all that lot, all kind of comes from this guy and his era. Again, he's considered a great king. The 100 Years' War was started with France. I think he was considered as a great soldier and a military commander and a great king. We're going to put Edward III. We'll put him as sound, I think, again. Again, I think he was seen to be well respected. Historians seem to like him. He was slightly brutal in France. Yeah, apart from like the 100 Years' War, I don't really know a lot about Edward III personally. I know that the Black Death was also during this guy's time as king, which killed a lot of people in England and a lot of people across Europe. So, yeah, the plague, the first like Great Plague, or the Black Death as it was called, was during Edward III's reign. So yeah, I think he was considered a great king. And we go from one of the greatest kings to again one of the worst kings and an utter bell end, and that's Richard II. And a boy king who became a tyrant, and one of the worst, if not probably the worst king England's ever had, probably. I mean, just not a great king, Richard II. I mean, there was that whole peasants' rebellion that he seemed to like subdue, but then all the people that had led that rebellion in London ended up getting executed and captured anyway. So he went back on his promise, because he said nothing would happen to them, but yeah, right, whatever. Also, later on in his reign, he just became an absolute tyrant. I think he actually thought he was a god as well. Yeah, basically, I think in the later part of his reign, he basically ran the country with tyranny, and like he had his own personal bodyguards and army that were kind of like a dictator, really. Not a very nice person, not very well liked by the people or the nobility. He was basically like a spoilt brat, I think. And I think he's also known as being maybe the first king that actually had a proper, like, official portrait of him painted of him. which I think it hangs in Westminster Abbey, and so he's known for that. So we get a good idea of what he looked like. I think he even read that sometimes if people even just looked at him funny and he didn't like them, he could have them like executed. I mean, it's just some of the things he did, especially in the late half of his reign, were just ridiculous. And it was so bad that he ended up getting overthrown by his own cousin. I think in the end he got imprisoned and starved to death. And it was his own cousin here, Henry IV, or Henry Bolingbroke, I think as he's known by. He was the first Lancastrian king, because this is when like the Wars of the Roses started to sort of like begin. They were all descendants of Edward III, and they were basically all related and cousins, but they clashed with each other. And Henry overthrew Richard II, which was probably a good thing. However, Henry wasn't really considered a great king either. He was seen more as a soldier. I think he was quite a well-respected soldier. He'd been often fighting battles. Quite a strong king. And I think people were just sick of Richard II, including his own cousin here, and they overthrew him. So Henry Bolingbroke, Henry IV. I think we'll put him at meh. Started the Lancastrian side of the throne. I think a lot of people were pleased that he just overthrew Richard II, because people just had enough of him. But in general, I don't think he was a great king. Wasn't king for a long time. Wasn't really a long reign. So yeah, we'll put Henry IV Bolingbroke in meh. And then trying to think of anything more to say about him really. I mean, I don't want to go on for too long anyway, because this video will be way too long. So his son, Henry V. Ooh, where do we put Henry V? I think we'll put him as sound. I think he's best known for the Battle of Agincourt in France, where he was severely outnumbered, I think for like 5-1, and then the English ended up beating the French. So he gets a lot of respect for that. I think that had a lot to do with the English archers. Like they had the longbow, the French had the crossbows, and the longbows were able to reach out for much further. It was something to do with that, but he was still known as a great soldier, a great warrior king. Led his army into battle, and I think he was an extremely religious man. But yeah, he's considered a great king, one of the greatest warrior kings. I think that was highlighted in Shakespeare's plays as well. But yeah, Henry V, great king, so one of the greatest warrior kings. Again, I don't think his reign was super long, and from one of the greatest kings, Henry V, to one of the worst kings of England, Henry VI. Yeah, Henry VI, what shall we say about this guy? From one of the strongest kings of England to one of the weakest kings of England. I think he had some good things about him. He was meant to be quite intelligent. Did he help find Cambridge or Oxford University or something like that? He was meant to be quite an intellectual person, read a lot of books. He was meant to be considered a quite a good philosopher. So there were good aspects about him, but the only problem is this was the 1400s, and to be king you had to have some sort of authority about you, or else you'll just flop. Plus, like, the French would take advantage of that, and so would the nobles and the barons. So he was seen as a very weak king. He wasn't interested in any sort of war or battle, so he ended up losing a lot of territory that his father had won. He just wasn't interested at all. He was known to suffer from, I think, mental illness, and he went mad. And he had a strong wife though, who kept things together. But ultimately, it's because of this guy the whole Wars of the Roses really kicked off. And he was actually king twice, as we'll get onto in a bit. But yeah, there's just one portrait of him, so he was king twice. But overall, I won't consider him a bell end. I mean, I actually think with Henry VI, if he was king today, he would probably be well liked. But this was the 1400s, and yeah, he wasn't a great king. And you had this whole beginnings of the Wars of the Roses, which was between the houses of Lancaster and York. Not to be confused with Yorkshire and Lancashire. It was about the royal houses, and they were basically fighting to become king. And Edward IV. Edward IV is one of them that some people would put maybe here or there, but I'm actually going to put Edward IV as sound. Again, like Henry V, he was a warrior king. Yeah, it was his father, Richard, the Duke of York, which kind of started off the Wars of the Roses, because Henry VI was such a weak king. His father put it on himself to try and usurp the throne from him, and that led to civil war, or the wars. I don't think it was called the Wars of the Roses at the time. That was something that was labelled later on afterwards. Edward IV, though, after his father got defeated in battle, came back to England, and it was the greatest and bloodiest and biggest battle fought on English soil still to this day, called the Battle, I think it's Taunton, in I think it was in Yorkshire somewhere. And Edward IV, at 18 years old, led his Yorkist army and defeated Henry VI's Lancastrian army. I mean, at 18, he fought in battle as well. I mean, this guy, great soldier. And yeah, he became King of England at 18, and through defeating the Lancastrians in battle. And Edward IV, I think as a king himself, he was probably meh, but because he was known as like a warrior king, and he was quite popular, people liked him. Yeah, Edward IV, he also became king twice, and because he had to flee from England, and Henry VI was put back on the throne, and then he came back again, and then he locked Henry VI up in the Tower of London. I think the whole history of the Wars of the Roses is quite interesting. It's one of the most interesting periods of English history and monarchs. But yeah, he was seen as this tall, good-looking king, a bit of a ladies' man, I think. He had a really unpopular marriage though with a commoner, Elizabeth Woodville, which a lot of people didn't like. She gained a lot of power over him, I think, which kind of maybe put him there. Do I keep him in sound? I'll keep him in sound because I do quite like Edward IV. I think he did bring some stability to the country. He wanted to like end the whole war, what had been going on, get back all the territories that England had lost. I think he did his best to become a good king, but it was just all the events that were surrounding him that you know, I mean, I think his relationship with his cousin Henry VI was actually pretty good, because he actually had Henry locked up in the Tower of London, but he was put under house arrest and was apparently well looked after. I think he knew that to secure his placement as king, he had to dispose of Henry, which I think he might have had a guilty conscience over. I mean, he probably didn't want to get rid of Henry, but he just had to get rid of him. And towards the end of his reign, there was actually a lot of stability in England, but unfortunately, after his premature death, things started to collapse again. So yeah, there's a lot of question marks over his legitimacy as well, because a lot of people even during his time as king questioned if he was actually his real father's son and not the son of some archer that his mother might have been sleeping with. But even if that was true, he could have still been king by right of conquest anyway. He still defeated Henry and the Lancastrians. So yeah, I mean, we'll never know the true answer to his legitimacy, but so I think there's a lot of question marks surrounding that. But like I said, he could have still become king by right of conquest anyway. So yeah, his unexpected death led towards England being sunk into more civil war and unrest, because unfortunately for this young chap here, Edward V, another boy king, he was never crowned. Edward IV's will made Richard the Duke Lord Protector over his son until he became of age, but that never happened, unfortunately. So Edward V is inconclusive, locked up in the Tower of London. But like Edward did with Henry, they were put under house arrest. I think they were well looked after for a time. There are many reasons why Richard did this. I mean, we'll get on to Richard in a sec, but yeah, Edward V. I think Elizabeth Woodville, his mother, they had a lot of, the Woodvilles themselves, the family had a lot of power over Edward V, and that caused Richard to want to like remove that. I mean, there was a lot of things happening in England after Edward's death, and if Richard didn't take control, then he could have easily lost all of his lands and possibly his head. So he knew he had to act. So Richard III is a tough one, because obviously because of Tudor propaganda and Shakespeare branding him a tyrant, and like I said, I mean, he was probably doing what he thought was best, and he knew that if he didn't act, then especially once Edward would have come of age, he probably would have been locked up in the Tower of London himself. Plus, he detested the Woodvilles, and he knew the power that they had over the young Edward, so he knew he had to like remove Edward from them somehow. And yeah, again, another huge question mark over Richard III. I mean, where'd you put him? He wasn't king for very long. I think he actually did one or two things, good things for England as king. He was well liked in the north of England as well, because he was like the biggest landowner in England, and a lot of that land was in the north of England. So he seemed to be very well liked by the people in the north of England. But even during his time, there was a lot of like question marks over should he become king, and he brought up the legitimacy of not only Edward here, young Edward V, but apparently Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was void, because I think Elizabeth Woodville was a divorcee and she was a commoner, and I think Edward, I think he might have been married before, privately or secretly. Anyway, he basically claimed that Edward was not legitimate because his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was not legitimate. Was Edward even legitimate as well? You know, I think Richard even raised that question, and a lot of people didn't believe Richard. Some people did, but I think Richard was quite ruthless. I mean, he made sure that people was on his side, and if he weren't on his side, then they were probably in fear of their lives. So a lot of question marks over Richard. Did he do it as well? There's still no evidence that he did have the princes in the Tower killed. I mean, if he did, he didn't do it himself. He obviously would have ordered someone to do it. But again, this was the 1400s. Both Richard and Edward had done the same to their brother, George of Clarence, who they had killed for treason. So yeah, this was the 1400s, things were brutal. To become king, you had to be ruthless. If he didn't act, then it was probably him that was going to meet his fate. So, and he was a legitimate claimant to the throne. He was a direct descendant. So yeah, Richard III. Oh. Because I think history is not being fair to him, and kings did do worse things than he did, I'm going to put him in meh. I think if it wasn't for the whole Princes in the Tower scandal and some of the brutal things he did, he'd probably be up here. But yeah, history's not been very fair to Richard, and I think if you look at both sides of the coin, you'll find that he wasn't probably a tyrant like many people thought he were. Was he a bad king? He wasn't king for very long though, so I think he had a lot of courage in him, because obviously at the Battle of Bosworth, he went to war, he led his army, and he was cut down off his horse, and unlike Shakespeare said, he actually refused the horse, cut down quite a few soldiers before he ended up meeting his fate on the battlefield. So he was meant to be quite a decent soldier, Richard, as well, quite a decent fighter. I do think he had some sort of bend in his spine, but he wasn't a hunchback. And the last Plantagenet king as well. So yeah, we'll stick Richard in the middle. I think it'd be unfair to put him there or there, so Richard III, meh. So, after the Battle of Bosworth Field, began the Tudor dynasty with Henry Tudor. Right, so Henry Tudor, or Henry VII, becomes king after the Battle of Bosworth Field, defeating Richard III. Again, Henry's legitimacy was questionable. I think it came through his mother's line, and they were barred from the throne, but he claimed succession by right of conquest, just to solidify his claim to the throne. Plus he ended up marrying Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, and he connected the two houses of Lancaster and York, and made the Tudor Rose, which was Yorkshire and House of York, the House of Lancaster, red rose and white rose combined. And, yeah, Henry Tudor. I think he was considered a decent king. We'll put him in sound. And he was meant to be really good with money. He helped to stabilise England. There were some rebellions against him, obviously, because there were still some people that didn't want a Lancastrian to be king, but he squashed the rest of them. I think most of the population by now accepted him as king and Elizabeth as queen. And yeah, I think he was quite well liked, quite intelligent, quite strict. Yeah, he was meant to be really good with money. He did a lot of people favours. I think the best way to describe Henry VII is you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours sort of character. And I think he was plagued by illness towards the end of his reign. I kind of feel sorry for him as well, because he lost his eldest son Arthur. He was meant to be the king after him, and then soon after he died, I think his wife died as well, so he went into mourning over that. And I think his relationship with Prince Henry wasn't as strong as it was with Arthur. And yeah, I think he overall is considered a decent king. Again, the start of the Tudor dynasty. I mean, this is when the country was sort of changing as well. and we were going into the 1500s now, and yeah, overall I think Henry VII was quite well liked. Not many bad things I can really say about him. I think he was born in Wales in Pembrokeshire Castle before he launched his invasion. And yeah, he was a Welshman, because I think the Tudors are known as like sort of like Welsh, and because he was born in Wales. I wonder if he spoke with a Welsh accent. But yeah, Henry Tudor, decent king. And now we're going to go on to one of the most controversial kings and most famous kings in English history, and Henry VIII. To be honest, I quite in mind to put him as a bellend, but he did do some good things, and I think as a young king and as a prince he was popular. It was sort of like during the middle and later on in his reign that he pretty much became an absolute bellend and a bit of a dickhead. Oh, where did we put him? I want to put him in bellend, but we'll put him in the middle again, because he created the navy, which was a good thing. He liked his archery, he liked his sports. Again, as a prince and as a young king, he was very well liked. Brought a lot of prosperity to England, I think, but that all started to decline when he had this obsession of having a son. I mean, he even created the Church of England because the Pope basically couldn't say he could divorce his first wife. So what did he do? He separated England from the Catholic Church and the Pope and made his own Protestant Church of England, which still stands to this day. So the Church of England, which still exists to this day, was brought on by because this guy here just wanted to divorce his first wife and the Pope said he couldn't. I mean, crazy really when you think about it. And after that, he also laid a lot of abbeys to ruin. He destroyed a lot of abbeys, and yeah, it's why we have a lot of like churches and abbeys in ruin now, because of this guy. Again, he had two of his wives beheaded, and for weak claims. I mean, I think did he claim Anne Boleyn was a witch? And I think the other one, is it Catherine Howard? I always get mixed up with his wives. The other one apparently was having an affair. So yeah, off with the chop. Off to the chopping block for you. So yeah, towards the end of his reign, he became a tyrant. Did a few good things. Was popular in his early reign and as a prince, but he became a big, fat, ugly tyrant. And to be honest, I don't really like the guy. The more you do your history on Henry VIII, the more you dislike him. It is interesting, you know, and he was a larger than life character. But in general, like, as a king, he was very like Jekyll and Hyde. He had a lot of good points to him and a lot of just awful points to him. So I'm just going to stick him in the middle just for the sake of that. Right, part 2. I had to cut yesterday's video because I had to go out and I was running out of time. I didn't realise this video was going to take so long. So I'll try not to talk as much about these monarchs. I mean, there's a lot of things that I forgot to say about them, and I'm quite happy with this list so far. So we ended with Henry VIII. The dissolution of the monasteries is what I was trying to think of as well. I mean, it's all there in the back of my head, but there's just certain things I forgot to say about some of these monarchs, and yeah, I might have not been correct with everything, but like I said, I'm not a historian. There's these ads that keep popping up as well. Sorry about that. I mean, like I said, it wants me to create a Twitter account, and I'm not creating a Twitter account just to use this. So Yeah, so we'll try and get through it as quickly as possible. So Henry VIII, yeah, sits about in the middle for me, I think. I want to put him there really, but he did a few good things when he was young. Edward VI, his son, became king. I'm actually going to put him inconclusive because he was only a boy when he became king, and he had people ruling for him. He was Protestant like his father. I think he died at like 15, 16 of TB, so he never really came of age to become like king and rule the country, so we're just going to put him inconclusive. I think this lady here is Lady Jane Grey, who Edward wanted to be the heir to the throne after his death, but yeah, again, she's inconclusive. She never became queen, I don't think. She was just called Lady Jane Grey. And it was because of this lady here, Mary, Henry VIII's eldest daughter, who became queen. Yeah, she had Lady Jane Grey locked up and executed. Unfortunately for her, she never became queen. So yeah, Mary the First, Bloody Mary, we're going to put her as a bell end because one of the worst monarchs, not very well liked. She was a Catholic, and like I said, Henry VIII had created like the Protestant Church of England. Yeah, she wanted England to be Catholic again, and she had a lot of Protestants burnt at the stake. She had a lot of people executed, which why she was nicknamed Bloody Mary. She also ruled England with the King of Spain, and at the time England wasn't exactly allies with Spain, and he was Catholic. I think it was called King Philip. It might have been King Philip II, I think it was. But yeah, she was married to the King of Spain. That didn't go down well with the English people, and yeah, she was one of the worst monarchs in my opinion, and she wasn't a nice person. So can't really say anything good about Queen Mary, to be honest. Not really a good time, I think, for the country. But then her younger sister, Elizabeth. I think we've got to stick Elizabeth here. She's our first champion, I'd say. And yeah, great monarch, well liked. Again, the English country became Protestant again under Elizabeth. And I think she was very well liked as a monarch. You know, nicknamed the Virgin Queen. It was around this time as well that England was like exploring other areas of the world, like America. I think is it the state of Virginia was named after Queen Elizabeth. And yeah, obviously the Spanish Armada that happened during her reign. Never got married, never got any kids. But yeah, she was well liked. They even named the dynasty after her, the Elizabethan era. So you don't have an era named after you if you're not popular. So she was definitely a popular queen. Seemed to be well liked. And unlike her older sister Mary here, she was quite lenient towards people that followed the Catholic faith. I mean, she didn't have any, as far as I know, she didn't have any Catholic priests burnt at the stake anyway. So even though she was Protestant, she was, you know, quite lenient towards religious views, which was a good thing obviously going forward. And yeah, I think most people know about Queen Elizabeth I. She was also the last Tudor monarch. So after she dies, her nephew, I think it was, is it a nephew? Becomes King James I, also King James VI of Scotland. His mother was Mary Queen of Scots, who was related to either Henry VII or Henry VIII, I can't remember which one, but he did have a legitimate claim to the throne. Even though he was a King of Scotland, he became the King of England as well, and sort of like united the royal houses of Scotland and England. Where do we put James I? I think we'll put him in. I think he was relatively a good king. We'll put him RE. He was known as the wisest fool of Christendom, created his own James I Bible. It was around this time that America was starting to get colonised by the British. I think they named Jamestown after King James. A lot of tobacco was being imported to Britain, so a lot of people started smoking tobacco in England, and James hated smoking. I think he even tried to ban it. So the smoking ban, which we've had just recently, James already did it back in like the 1600s, or was it the late 1500s, around that time. He's obviously known as well for the Gunpowder Plot and Guy Fawkes. I think the only bad thing about King James is he had that divine right of kings sort of like mindset, which he didn't really practice that much because he was probably wise enough not to overthrow Parliament. But unfortunately for his son here, Charles I, he was brainwashed into the divine right of kings by God, where he thought that he should only speak to God, and that he probably thought he was a god, and that and he shut down Parliament so many times. Where do we put Charles I? The trouble with Charles I, though, he was quite popular. I mean, obviously the Civil War happened, but he had a lot of supporters. A lot of people fought for Charles. A lot of people were royalists back then. So was he a tyrant? I won't say he was a tyrant as such. I just think his thoughts on the divine right of a kingship, and that, you know, he shouldn't have to answer to Parliament. Was he a bellend? I'm just going to put him as a bad king. I mean, obviously the English Civil War happened. There was a lot of support for Charles up and down the country. A lot of people fought for him. In the end, he lost his head. He got executed. And I've noticed here, Oliver Cromwell isn't on this list. I guess technically because Oliver Cromwell wasn't a monarch. He was just named as Lord Protector of England, or Dictator. He isn't in this list. But yeah, you had the period where Charles gets executed. Oliver Cromwell, he becomes Lord Protector of England, and his son as well, for a short period of time. But the English people weren't happy, I don't think, about that. They wanted the monarchy restored. I think even Parliament in the end wanted the monarchy restored. Yeah, one thing I wanted to say about as well about Oliver Cromwell is, just as I said before about Henry VIII, how a lot of abbeys and churches and chapels became ruined because of him, of the dissolution of the monasteries. Oliver Cromwell, after the Civil War, where he defeated Charles I, because the royalists used a lot of the castles for like defensive purposes, Oliver Cromwell had a lot of the castles basically laid to ruin. He wanted a lot of the castles just knocked down and laid to ruin. So that's why there's a lot of castles in this country which are just in ruin. It's because of Oliver Cromwell, not just because of how old they are. So I actually think that's quite interesting, because if it wasn't for this guy here, Henry VIII, a lot of the chapels and abbeys would still be in probably good condition. And if it wasn't for Oliver Cromwell, a lot of the castles would also still be standing in being good condition. So it's kind of a shame that that happened in history, because I do like visiting like castles and abbeys and cathedrals. So yeah, anyway, Charles II. So yeah, the restoration of the monarchy, and Charles II becomes king, Charles I's eldest son. And yeah, we're going to put Charles II, I'd say, in all right. He was nicknamed the Merry Monarch. I think he was quite well liked by the people. I think he did shut down Parliament maybe once, twice. So again, he was pushing it. He was pushing it like his father, but not as much. But yeah, he also fought with the royalists for his father. So the fact that he was invited back to become monarch was kind of a strange sort of thing, when he'd been fighting on the royalist side. In fact, I think he had a lot of people that fought for Oliver Cromwell, or had Charles executed. He had a lot of them arrested and executed. So yeah, the tables were sort of like turning back now. But yeah, Charles II, I think he's seen as a good monarch. He was quite well liked. I think the Great Fire of London, is sort of like one of the famous things that happened during his reign, and so a lot of London was destroyed. The plague came back, the Black Death. I think that killed a lot of people, especially in London. But the Great Fire ended up curbing that a bit. So yeah, I think the only trouble with Charles II is on his death, I think he made himself Catholic, whereas obviously Parliament wanted the king to be Protestant, and again the whole religious sort of thing came back again, and that's where James II here, he was a Catholic. Again, these are all Stuart kings. I forgot to mention at the beginning of James I, it was the beginning of the Stuart era. So yeah, we've got James II. I think it was Charles's younger brother. Another interesting thing about James II, he was obviously the Duke of York. I think it was when Charles II was king, and they named New York in America after this guy, James II, when he was Duke of York. And James II, ooh, definitely a bad king. Basically, during his reign, people tried to overthrow him. There was quite a few battles, and in the end, Parliament eventually asked this guy here, William of Orange, William III, to come to England in what was known as a Glorious Revolution. And this guy was Dutch, which is why he was called William of Orange. And he came with an army, but I think James II eventually just fled the country. There was no like real battle. That's why it was called the Glorious Revolution, because I don't think anybody got killed. And I think Parliament wanted Mary here, Mary II, to become queen. But basically, I think she was like, she didn't want to rule on her own, so she was obviously married to this guy. So they ruled as joint king and queen. So I'm going to sort of put these two together. William II, or William of Orange, did reign on his own because Mary died prematurely, and William just reigned on his own. But again, after James II, you know, this whole thing as well started with Jacobites, where James II's descendants basically tried to claim the throne again. And they obviously had strong support in Scotland, because obviously the Stuarts were from Scotland. Scotland was Catholic, England was Protestant. So obviously you had the whole Jacobite thing going on, where James's relatives basically tried to claim back the throne for like the next 100 years or so, but that didn't happen in the end. So anyway, Mary II and William III of Orange. I think we're going to put these two. Do we put them same? We'll put these two at R8. I think the country was relatively at peace when these two became king and queen. They were seen to be well liked. I think it was actually around this time as well where the monarchs lost a lot of power. Basically, it was mainly Parliament that made all the decisions. The king and queen were mainly becoming more just like a state head or head of state. They were sort of like just figures. It was Parliament making most of the decisions, and they made a rule that every monarch pretty much from now on would have to be Protestant, and this is why obviously this chap who fled wasn't happy about that, and he claimed that he had more right to the throne than obviously Mary did, but Parliament didn't think that, and they overruled that. So yeah, King William and Queen Mary, I think they're seen as decent monarchs, and then William on his own as well. I think we'll put him at RE. Not much to say about him really. I mean, ooh. So anyway, the last Stuart monarch, Queen Anne. Again, I think Queen Anne was the youngest sister of James II and Mary II. That's how she became queen, and she was Protestant as well. She didn't really do much again around this time. The monarch now was just basically head of state. They didn't really make that many decisions. They didn't really have much power. I'm going to put Queen Anne again at R8. I think she was just known for like having a quiet life, playing cards. She had a lot of like friends, female friends. Again, there's sort of like conspiracies that Anne might have been bisexual, just like James had his favourites here. Anne had her female favourites, but they kept it private anyway, probably. It's just what people probably thought at the time. But yeah, Queen Anne. I think she united. It was during her reign, Queen Anne's reign, where Parliament united Scotland, England, Wales. So it became like Great Britain, or the Union of Nations, or whatever it were called. So obviously it was around during her era that the British flag, or the Union Jack, was first created. I don't know why it took so long, since King James here, of 6 of Scotland and 1st of England, sort of like united the royal houses of England and Scotland, but it took until Queen Anne's era that it became a united kingdom. So yeah, that happened during her reign. I kind of feel sorry for Anne as well, because she had a lot of stillborns and miscarriages. So she tried her best to have like children, but it didn't really work out well for her. So it must have been an awful time for her, really. I mean, so yeah, there's Queen Anne. Yeah, I think she was quite well liked, the last Stuart monarch. And so after Anne, we get to this German guy here. In fact, there was a lady called Sophia of Hanover, and she was basically the Queen of Hanover, but she died before Queen Anne. I think not long, maybe months before Queen Anne, so it went to her son, George I, King of Hanover. So he was very much a German. I don't think he even spoke English, he just spoke German. And he was invited to obviously England to become the crowned king. I don't think he spent much time in England at all, he just spent most of his time in Hanover. Again, it was Parliament now that was making all the decisions. The king now was more of a figurehead, so he probably didn't need to spend much time in England anyway. George I, where do we put him? We put him at Meh. It was during this time as well that we had the Jacobite rising with James II's descendants. I think they were called like the Old Pretender and the Young Pretender, Bonnie Prince Charlie. That all happened during George I and George II's reign. I think he was something like the second cousin or like great nephew of like one of the Stuarts. So that's how he became king. So I always wondered, how on earth did this German man from Hanover become King of England? Yeah, not much to say about George I. I mean, we'll put him as Meh. And that comes to his son, George II. I think we'll put George II a bit higher than George I, or I do think he spent more time in England than his father did. He probably did speak better English than his father did, but he still saw himself as a German, and I think he spent most of his time in Hanover still. Again, you had the whole Jacobite thing going on. I think it was Bonnie Prince Charlie at this point, but they ended up getting defeated. George II is also known as the last king to fight in battle. It was either George I or George II. I think it was George I, Robert Walpole, the first Prime Minister of England. So basically when George I was king, we had the first Prime Minister. So basically he did all the dirty work anyway for George. I mean, George was happy enough being in Hanover while the Prime Minister was basically controlling England, making all the decisions with Parliament. So like I said, the kings and queens of England now were just basically a figurehead. Another interesting thing, I think it was during George II's reign, the national anthem, God Save the King, was created. However, the national anthem was originally written for the French king, and the English stole it and sang it for George II, and it stuck, and it's been there ever since. Now George III was George II's grandson, because George II's eldest son, I think, died before he did, so that came to George III. Now George III is quite controversial because obviously the American Revolutionary Wars happened and United States of America gained their independence from Great Britain. And I think there were a lot of Americans that actually fought for George III and fought. They wanted to remain part of Great Britain. So I think that's sometimes sort of like overlooked. But in the end, they did become a United States. And so a lot of people that wanted the United States and fought for the United States obviously regarded this guy as a tyrant or a monster, and he wasn't at all. He was actually a pretty decent king, George III. I think he was a much better king than George I and II. We're going to put... Where do we put him? I'm actually going to put George III as sound. He had a strong relationship with his wife. Unlike most of the other Georgian kings, he didn't have mistresses. He seemed to be a decent family man. He had a lot of kids. I think his interests were like in agriculture and farming, and he seemed like a decent king. I mean, he seemed to be quite well liked. I think he did get involved with Parliament a lot, and I think it was around this time the Prime Ministers, was it William Pitt and William Pitt the Younger, the Prime Ministers. Obviously he lost America, and I think he took that quite badly as well, because a lot of Americans probably dislike this guy, but I think he actually had a lot of love for America and Americans. It's just unfortunate with what happened, and you got to understand it wasn't because of this guy, it was Parliament that had all the power. So it wasn't like this guy had absolute power. It was Parliament making all the decisions on the taxes and everything like that. And I think it was during this time as well, when they lost America, they concentrated more on like Canada and Australia. He was actually born in Great Britain, unlike these two, and I think he classed himself more as like a British or English monarch rather than a German, and spoke English as his first language. So yeah, George III, I think it would put him in sound. He was also the longest reigning monarch up until this point, and the longest reigning, I think he's still to this day the longest reigning king. He did suffer with like an illness towards the end of his reign. He was nicknamed Mad King George, but I don't think that's fair in him, because they dug up his grave, I think, and they found like in his hair he'd been suffering from some disease, which obviously affects like what was going on with him. I think he was like, back when he was king, he was claimed to like just talk gibberish and talk to trees and all that bollocks, but he was obviously suffering from an illness which the doctors didn't know what it were at the time, but they obviously knew when they exhumed his grave. So yeah, he gets the nickname Mad King George, but I don't think that's fair. They probably just thought he was going mad back in the 1700s, but they obviously didn't know what was wrong with him. And it was during this time that his son here, George IV, was Prince Regent. So yeah, George III, yeah, one of the better kings we've had, I think. Put him as sound. I don't think he deserves a lot of the hate that he gets. George IV, he was Prince Regent while George III was still king, but he became George IV. Where do we put this guy? I think we've got to put him as bad, really, but the thing is with George IV is he was seen as a bit of a player, gambler, plenty of mistresses. He was overweight, bit of a... It kind of reminds me of those early Roman emperors like Caligula and Nero, where he saw himself as this like extravagant sort of figure and character, but I think a lot of people mocked him. They even made him into like a cartoon character. I think the good things about George IV, though, he sort of like rebuilt Buckingham Palace. I think at the time it was called something like Buckingham House, and he made it into a palace, which is obviously Buckingham Palace, which we have now. He also built the Brighton Pavilion. He also built other structures, and So yeah, quite an extravagant sort of character. He also barred his wife from his coronation, locked the doors. So yeah, he didn't care for his wife much. His coronation was hugely expensive, probably the biggest and most expensive coronation that any monarch's ever had. But yeah, wasn't really a great king. It was during his reign. I don't know whether it was when he was a regent or king that the whole Napoleonic Wars happened. So you had all that going on in the early 1800s. But yeah, he wasn't really seen as a great king. Became severely overweight, I think, towards the end of his reign. Obviously, this photo of him doesn't show that, but yeah, he wasn't really seen as a great king, George IV. Quite an interesting character. Didn't really get on with his father that much. Yeah, so we'll stick him there in bad. Anyway, so this chap dies. In fact, he actually had a daughter, Charlotte, who the public loved, and they couldn't wait for Charlotte to become queen, so we would have had a Queen Charlotte, but unfortunately, I think at the age of 21, she died during childbirth. So yeah, the whole country was in mourning over that, so after Charlotte died, unfortunately, there was no heir to the throne. Well, he had no legitimate children, should I say. So after George comes his younger brother, William IV. Much better king than George IV, known as a sailor king because he spent most of his time in the navy. I think William was seen more as like a man of the people. He even picked up public in his horse and carriage, so he seemed to be quite well liked by the public. Spent most of his time in the military, but probably didn't even expect to be king. He was quite old when he became king. I think he was only king for about 10 years as well. So he was basically already retired when he became king. I think we'll stick William IV. Where do we put William IV? I think we'll put him in sound because I think it was during his reign, and I'm sure he was a part of it in Parliament. They passed a bill, and it was something to do with workers because it was around William's time that the whole Industrial Revolution sort of really started to happen. Like the whole invention of steam engines and everything started, and locomotives, and obviously there were a lot of children working in mines, and it was something to do with the ages of children and or the amount of hours that people worked, whether it be in the mills or the mines or anything like that. And this guy was basically, along with Parliament, passed a bill where basically where they said that you had to be a certain age or work so many hours. So it was kind of like the beginning of, say, the unions, probably, you know, where workers' rights started to come into force because of the Industrial Revolution. So again, that's another good thing to say about William. I think he was quite well respected. Also, his coronation cost like 1/5 of what his older brother's coronation was. So yeah, we'll stick William IV. Again, he wasn't king for long, but it'd be unfair for me to put him there just because he wasn't king for long. I think in general, if he'd been king for like 30 plus years instead of like 10 years, he would probably be considered like one of the best kings I've had. But yeah, we'll just stick him in sound. Right. Probably one of the most popular monarchs we've ever had, Queen Victoria. She's got to go up there, hasn't she, alongside Elizabeth. Yeah, again, she's seen as a great monarch. I think during Victoria's reign, which they obviously called the Victorian era, you had the whole Industrial Revolution thing. Britain was becoming one of the main powers of the world. Yeah, so you had all that stuff going on. Obviously, she was just a figurehead now. She had no real power. Strong marriage to Albert, had a lot of kids. After Albert died, though, she sort of locked herself away. Wasn't seen much in public. It's like she almost lived in mourning after his death. But I think as a monarch, she was well respected, well liked. It's the thing is with Queen Victoria, it's not so much about her, it's about all of the events that happened during the time she was Queen. A lot of history and what was going on in Britain and overseas as well. And, obviously, it was around this time that Britain had its empire, which covered all over the globe. I think the Navy had a lot to do with that. You know, Britain had like the largest and most powerful Navy at the time. But yeah, Queen Victoria, she was well liked. So we'll stick her in champion because we couldn't stick her anywhere else really, you know what I mean? So yeah, she deserves to be at the top. So we'll go on to her eldest son, Edward. So yeah, Edward the Seventh. Edward had a strange relationship with his mother and his father. I think even his own mother, Victoria, blamed him for Albert's death, which is it's a bit over the top, but yeah, Albert, I think he was called Albert, even though he was named Edward. So Edward the Seventh. I think we'll put him as sound. Or do we? No, we'll put him as sound. I think he was very popular as a prince, Prince of Wales, and he was only king for about 10 years. Again, he had this sort of like playboy sort of like personality and demeanour about him. Plenty of mistresses. He liked to smoke cigars, drink a lot of alcohol, gamble a lot. Seen as a bit of a player, I think. For 10 years or 10, 11 years he was king, it was known as the Edwardian era. It was around this time, along with say, his mother Victoria, that Britain had its empire and all that lot. I think it was around this time as well in Europe, a lot of the world leaders who were all pretty much related to Victoria were like squabbling with each other. Like you had Wilhelm II, who was like the eldest grandson of Queen Victoria, who was Kaiser of Germany. So you had all that stuff going on, so it sort of like was building up to the First World War. But I think Edward VII, he was well liked, and he was seen as quite a cheery character. And again, he had his own era named after him, the Edwardian era. So yeah, we'll keep Edward VII as sound. I think that's fair enough. So we go on to his son, George V. I know I'm not that keen on George V. I'm actually going to put him I'm going to put him as meh. I was going to put him as bad, but that's a bit harsh, I think. I'll put him as a meh. Yeah, not really too much of a fan about George V. I mean, he sort of disowned his youngest son, Prince John, because he suffered from epilepsy. And yeah, he didn't treat him very well. He put him in the hands of carers. And he didn't treat any of his other sons quite well either. I mean, he had a bit of a strange relationship with Edward here and George. Yeah, I think he had quite a strong relationship with his wife, but he was very strict. He had that sort of very military, sort of like strict, dull sort of personality about him. I think he took his job like very seriously, and his time as king very seriously, but he didn't bail out his cousin as well in Russia, Nicholas, and his family. And they all ended up getting executed when they wanted to seek asylum in Britain, but George didn't allow that. So yeah, there's a lot of question marks over this guy. I don't really like him that much, just because of the way he was with his family, and he was kind of dull. Obviously, the First World War happened during his reign, and he changed his name from Saxon-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor because he knew that a lot of people saw him as a German, which he kind of was. And obviously, with England going to war with Germany, he felt the best thing to do was to change the royal house name to Windsor, which I think was a good move. And it still stands to this day, Windsor. I think even Charles III has kept the name Windsor when he could have changed it. In general, I don't know, I'll stick him in middle. I think he just about fits in there. So anyway, on to his son, Edward VIII. Now Edward was actually quite popular as a prince, and even when he became king, obviously he was never crowned, but when he became king after George's death, he was well liked. But the whole scandal with his marriage, and it only came out a long time after I think even after his death, that he was pretty much like a neo-Nazi. I think he even met with Adolf Hitler a few times. Yeah, not the kind of character that Britain wanted to become king, I don't think. Plus, Wallis Simpson was a divorcee, and Parliament ruled that he shouldn't really be marrying a divorcee, but they obviously knew that something else was going on behind the scenes. I'm sure Winston Churchill probably knew what was going on with him and his beliefs, but yeah, I mean, like I said, he was originally quite popular. The people seemed to really like him, but they obviously didn't know what was going on behind the scenes back then. And because of that, we've got to put him in Bell End. I mean, I think because he seemed to have a decent, like, sort of like personality and was a bit of a character. He was kind of well liked and he was quite popular, but because obviously his father was quite dull. But because of what we now know about him and why he really didn't become king, and I don't think it was anything to do with Wallis Simpson, yeah, he's got to be put there, hasn't he? So yeah, Parliament says that he can't become king really, and that his younger brother should become king instead, George VI. And yeah, this is probably one of the easiest decisions for me, and that's boom, champion. George VI probably didn't even think he was going to become king. Probably didn't even want to become king, but it was his duty. And he struggled with his speech a lot. Yeah, I really like George VI. I mean, I think his real name was Albert, and all of his friends and family called him Bertie, and that's what he was known by, but he was named as George VI as king. And great man, I quite admire him. I mean, great family man, had a good relationship with the Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth. Two daughters, obviously, Elizabeth and Mary. During the Second World War, he decided to stop in England. I think he sometimes spent his time in Buckingham Palace, sometimes he spent his time in Windsor Castle, while the bombing raids were going on in the Blitz. And he visited a lot of the public, a lot of the bomb places in London and other places in England. And he stood against Hitler and fascism, unlike his brother here. And yeah, he was well respected, well liked by the public. I actually think his daughter Elizabeth, she became the queen that she became because of her own father. The only thing with George VI, though, he was a chain smoker. He smoked like a chimney. And I think that caused his premature death. I think he had lung cancer, didn't he, or something like that. And I think he was only in his 50s when he died. And it's a shame really, but back then a lot of people smoked. And yeah, George VI is champion to me. Probably the greatest king. Well, if you look at all these guys, he's the only king that I've put at the top of the list. I mean, yeah, well respected, well liked. I think he did his duty well. And it's just a shame he wasn't king for longer, really. So yeah, I think he deserves to be at the top. So like I said, Elizabeth, she became queen quite young because George VI's early death. And again, just like her own father, boom, straight at the top, champion. Yeah, just like her father, I think she was a great monarch, well loved by the people, well respected. I don't think her reign was completely perfect. There were probably one or two things that you could like point her out with, but in general, I mean, you cannot deny that Queen Elizabeth reign. I think they're calling it like the second Elizabethan era. So just like Queen Elizabeth I, I think she'll go down in history as one of Britain's greatest monarchs. Reigned for, was it 70 plus years? So by far the longest reigning monarch, overtaking Victoria. Yeah, I mean, what can you say about Elizabeth? I mean, she reigned for so long. I mean, the world, Britain, the country, everything's changed during her reign. And I think, you know, the person that she became had a lot to do with her father, and also the relationship that she had with her mother, the Queen Mother. The Queen Mother was, Elizabeth, was also very well liked and had a state funeral. I think was it 2000, 2001 when her mother died. But yeah, like George VI, the Queen Mother and Elizabeth herself were all really well liked, well respected, and I think both of them deserve to be at the top. I would even put George and Elizabeth II above Elizabeth I and Victoria as well. I think these two, they're sort of like the staple of how a British monarch should be, I think. And yeah, in terms of Charles III as well, I mean, he's not on this list. These are just the Saxons. I'll probably do a separate video on the Saxons if this video does well. People are interested in me doing that. But yeah, these two here, George and Elizabeth, definitely come at the top for me. Yeah, like I said, Charles III isn't on this list, but I'd probably put Charles at meh. His coronation's coming up soon as well. Either meh or alright, I'll put Charles III. Got nothing really against Charles. I mean, some people don't like him for some reason. I mean, there's that whole sort of like Diana thing, you know, that happened in the 90s with him, but I don't know, in general, I think just like his mother, he has that sense of duty, and obviously he's more outspoken than his mother was, so I think maybe because he's more outspoken about certain things, people don't agree with him, so that's maybe why they don't really like him. Some people think we shouldn't even have a monarch in this country and we should be a republic. So there's various reasons why Charles is probably not, well, he's not as popular as Elizabeth was, but why maybe people don't really like him that much. But for me, I've got nothing against Charles. I think I'd even put him in alright or meh. So yeah, that's my list. I'm quite happy with it. Like I said, it's just for fun, this. I mean, it's whatever. I mean, if you disagree with it, that's fine. I mean, we all have our own opinions. There's a lot of stuff that I've probably forgot to mention about these kings and queens, or I might have got wrong. I mean, like I said, it's just for a bit of fun. And yeah, anyway, thanks for watching. If you've got any comments, put them down below. Please like, subscribe if you wish, and comment down below. And yeah, kind of a long video, this one. My brain's all mashed. So yeah, it was fun anyway. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.